June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers, 3,600 tanks, and 7,000 artillery pieces smashed across the Soviet border in a single devastating wave. This was the Wehrmacht at the absolute peak of its power. They were the masters of a new kind of war, the Blitzkrieg, a lightning war of speed, violence, and, most importantly, coordination. The German Panzer crews, riding in their Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, were arguably the finest soldiers in the world. They were veterans, hardened by the campaigns in Poland and the stunning 6-week conquest of France. They operated with a ruthless efficiency, linked by radios, coordinating with their Stuka dive bombers and motorized infantry. They expected the Soviet Union to be their easiest victory yet. Their intelligence told them the Red Army was a primitive, poorly led rabble, shattered by Stalin's recent Great Purge of its officer corps. They expected to face tanks that were little more than tractors with guns. And the German infantry was confident. They had the Pak-36, a 37mm anti-tank gun that was light, fast-firing, and had proven itself more than capable of knocking out every Polish, French, and British tank it had ever faced. It was, they believed, the perfect weapon. The invasion began, and for the first 48 hours, their assumptions seemed correct. They advanced 50, 60, yet to 70 miles. Soviet divisions, caught by surprise, evaporated, and then they met it. It began as rumors, a single report from a reconnaissance unit, then another, a garbled radio message from a forward infantry company, followed by silence. Then, the lead elements of the 6th Panzer Division, part of Army Group North, were rolling toward the town of Raseiniai in Lithuania. Their goal was to seize the critical Dubysa River bridges. The column was led by Kampfgruppe von Seckendorf, a battle group of over 100 tanks, artillery, and motorized infantry. They were the tip of the spear. As they approached the river, their scouts saw it. It was sitting on the road, blocking the crossroads. It was huge. It was ugly. And it was alone. The German commanders were not impressed. It was one lone, primitive-looking Soviet tank. They gave the order for their own light tanks, Panzer 35 and Ts, to fan out and destroy it. The Panzers opened fire, and their shells bounced. They ricocheted off the tank's thick, dark green armor, whining into the sky like harmless pebbles. The tank's turret, with a sound like a barn door swinging, slowly turned. A single massive flash, a high explosive shell, and a German Panzer was ripped in half. The other German tanks, stunned, began firing desperately, maneuvering, trying to get a shot at its side or rear. Flash. A second Panzer exploded. The remaining tanks, their crews in a state of total panic, retreated out of range. The German commanders were baffled. This was impossible. They brought up their infantry support. They brought up their anti-tank guns. They brought up the Pak-36. The crews frantically unlimbered the gun, aimed at the center mass of the monster, and opened fire. Clang, 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 clang. The 37mm shells, which had once been the terror of Europe, did nothing. They chipped the paint. The tank's turret turned again. It fired a single machine gun burst, and the entire German Pak-36 crew was dead. For the Wehrmacht, this was not just a battle. It was a moment of sheer existential shock. They had just met the KV-1, the Klim Voroshilov, and for the next 24 hours, this one invincible tank would hold an entire German Panzer division hostage. This single terrifying encounter at Raseiniai was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a massive, systemic failure of German intelligence and the dawn of a new era in tank warfare. The Germans had run into tank shock. What the Kampfgruppe at Raseiniai was facing was a KV-1, a Kliment Voroshilov heavy tank. It was a machine built on a completely different philosophy than anything in the German arsenal. The German Blitzkrieg doctrine prized speed, communication, and coordination. Their Panzer III, the main battle tank, was a well-balanced machine. It had a good gun, decent armor, and crucially, a 5-man crew. This included a dedicated tank commander in the turret who could observe the battlefield, direct the driver, and find targets for the gunner. Every tank had a radio. They were a coordinated pack of wolves. The Soviet KV-1 was a fortress. It was a breakthrough tank, designed with one goal: to be completely immune to any anti-tank gun on the field. And it was. The technical specifications tell the whole story. The standard German anti-tank gun, the Pak-36, fired a 37mm shell. At 500 meters, it could penetrate, at best, 30mm of armor. The German Panzer III's frontal armor was 30mm. It was a perfect match. The KV-1's frontal armor was 75mm of solid, high-quality rolled steel. Its side armor was 60mm. The German gun crews were firing shells that were physically incapable of penetrating their target, even at point-blank range. The Pak-36, which had been the pride of the Wehrmacht, was suddenly revealed to be a useless pea shooter. The frontline soldiers, in their gallows humor, gave it a new nickname: the Heeresanklopgerät, the army's door knocker. All it could do was chip the paint. To make matters worse, the KV-1's 76.2mm gun could, and did, rip a Panzer III apart from over 1,000 meters away. And the KV-1 wasn't even the only monster. In other sectors, German panzer columns were encountering the other revolutionary Soviet design, the T-34. The T-34, with its revolutionary sloped armor, was proving just as resistant. Its 50mm of angled steel was deflecting German shells just as easily as the KV-1's raw thickness. The German Wehrmacht had invaded a country they believed was technologically primitive, only to find themselves, for the first time, technically outclassed on the battlefield. But this is where the story gets intricate, because the KV-1, for all its invincibility, was a deeply, deeply flawed machine. It was, in reality, a terrible tank. It was notoriously unreliable. Its transmission was so bad that drivers had to use a hammer to shift gears. Its V2 diesel engine, while powerful, was prone to breakdowns. For every KV-1 knocked out by the Germans, it's estimated that 2 or 3 were simply abandoned by their crews after they broke down. It was also ergonomically disastrous. It had a cramped 2-man turret. This meant the tank commander was also the gunner. He had to load the main gun, aim it, fire it, and also try to command the tank, all while peering through a primitive, narrow periscope. He had no 360-degree cupola. He was blind, and most critically, almost none of them had radios. This was the great paradox of 1941. The battlefield was full of these invincible Soviet giants, but they were blind, deaf, and clumsy. They couldn't coordinate. They would blunder forward, one by one, into German ambushes, where, despite their armor, they would eventually be surrounded and destroyed. But the Germans at Raseiniai didn't know any of that. They didn't know their target was blind. They didn't know its transmission was failing. All they knew was that it was still sitting on the road. It had just destroyed their anti-tank guns. It had knocked out their panzers, and it was blocking the entire 6th Panzer Division's advance. The Kampfgruppe was paralyzed by one tank. The sun was setting. They were desperate. They would have to try something new. The German commanders at Raseiniai were now in a desperate, humiliating position. The sun was setting on the first day of the operation, and their entire battle group was being held captive by a single, immobile tank. They tried their next logical step, heavier artillery. They carefully, under cover, maneuvered a 105mm field howitzer into a direct fire position. This was not an anti-tank gun. It fired a large, heavy, high-explosive shell designed to destroy buildings and trench systems. The gun crew aimed, they fired. The shell hit the KV-1 with a tremendous crash. The tank was engulfed in smoke. The German soldiers cheered, and then the smoke cleared. The tank was still there. Its track was damaged, its fender blown off, but its armor was not breached. The high-explosive shell had shattered against the thick steel, doing only superficial damage. And then, the KV-1's turret began to turn. It had spotted the howitzer's muzzle flash. A single 76.2mm shell, and the entire German artillery piece and its crew were blasted into shrapnel. The Germans were now in a state of shock. Their tanks were useless. Their anti-tank guns were useless. Their artillery was useless. Night fell. The KV-1 sat in the darkness, a silent, menacing shadow. This is when the Pioniers were called in, the elite German combat engineers. Their job was to do what cannons could not. A small squad, armed with a geballte Ladung, a concentrated charge, which was essentially several potato masher stick grenades strapped around a 3-kilogram high explosive charge, began to crawl. They moved silently through the fields, in the total darkness, for over an hour, until they were right under the shadow of the tank. The Soviet crew, blind and deaf inside their steel box, suspected nothing. The engineers managed to get onto the tank itself. They planted their satchel charges on the thickest part of the armor, lit the fuses, and ran. Kaboom! The explosion was deafening. A blinding white flash in the night. The German commanders, watching from a safe distance, were certain. Nothing could survive that. And then, nothing happened. The engineers had failed. The explosive charge, though powerful, was not a shaped charge. It had detonated against the armor, but had not penetrated it. The KV-1, now thoroughly infuriated, began to fire its machine guns blindly into the darkness, spraying the fields all around it, forcing the surviving engineers to flee for their lives. Dawn of the second day. The KV-1 was still there. It was scarred, dented. One of its tracks was broken, but its gun was still active. It had paralyzed a German battle group for more than 24 hours. The divisional commander was furious. The Blitzkrieg had ground to a halt because of one tank. He gave the order for the unorthodox solution. He called in the 88, the German 88mm flak gun. This was the Wehrmacht's magic weapon. But it wasn't an anti-tank gun. It was an anti-aircraft gun. It was designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers. And to do that, it had to fire a very heavy 20-pound shell at an incredibly high velocity to reach targets 3 or 4 miles in the sky. The Germans had learned, by accident, in the deserts of North Africa and the fields of France, that this high-velocity flak gun was the only thing in their arsenal that could kill heavy tanks. A crew from a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft battalion was ordered to move their massive high-profile gun onto the front line. This was a suicide mission for the 88 crew. They were a huge target. If the KV-1 saw them setting up, it would kill them in one shot. So the Germans devised a plan. They sent their remaining fast-moving Panzers on a distraction run. The Panzers sped out from a different side of the field, firing their useless guns at the KV-1, making as much noise as possible. The plan worked. The blind two-man turret of the KV-1 swung away to face the threat of the Panzers, and in that moment, the 88, hidden in the trees, was given the order to fire. Crack! The sound of an 88 is not a boom. It is a sharp, terrifying supersonic crack. The shell hit the KV-1's turret. There was no clang, no ricochet. The high-velocity, armor-piercing shell punched straight through the 75mm plate, as if it were cardboard. Crack! A second shot. This one hit the hull. Crack! A third. The Invincible tank finally went silent. The German soldiers, who had been terrorized for a full day, cautiously emerged from their cover. They approached the smoking, silent hulk. They were in awe. They climbed on top, and they counted the impact marks. The tank's armor was covered in dozens of small, circular pockmarks, where the 37mm anti-tank guns had harmlessly bounced off, and on its side and turret were 3 neat, perfectly drilled holes from the 88. The Battle of Raseiniai was over, but the tank shock of the KV-1 and the T-34 had just begun. This single encounter, and hundreds like it, sent a wave of panic all the way back to Berlin. It forced German engineers to race back to the drawing board. It proved that the Pak-36 was obsolete, and it led directly to the creation of the next generation of German weapons, the longer, high-velocity 75mm gun, and the tank that would become the most feared of the war, the Tiger. The smoking hulk of the Raseiniai KV-1 was a symbol. For the German soldiers, it was a terrifying trophy. For the German High Command, it was a red alert. The tank shock of 1941 was not just about a single superior machine. It was about the sudden, horrifying realization that their entire anti-tank doctrine was obsolete. Reports were flooding in from every army group. From Army Group South, General von Kleist, a Panzer commander, sent a frantic report. The finest tanks in the world are with the Russians. Our Pak-36 is useless. We are desperate. From General Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg himself, in Army Group Center, the T-34 is vastly superior to our Panzer IV. Its gun is more effective. Its armor is thicker. We are suffering enormous losses. The Germans, for the first time, were outgunned. And this created a new, desperate race. The engineers in Germany had already started designing the Tiger, but that was a 1942 solution. The army on the front line needed to survive today. This led to a period of brilliant, desperate, and often suicidal improvisation by the frontline troops. Their first solution was the one that had worked at Raseiniai, the Flak 88. This was a logistical nightmare. The 88 was a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft gun. It belonged to the Air Force. Army commanders had to beg, borrow, or steal these guns from the flak battalions assigned to protect their rear echelons. But when they got them, they were lethal. The 88 was the only thing that could kill a KV-1 or a T-34 from a safe distance. German Panzer units began to develop new tactics. They would use their fast but weak Panzer IIIs as bait. They would advance, make contact with a group of Soviet monsters, and then, while firing their useless guns, they would deliberately lure the blind, radioless Soviet tanks into a kill zone. This was a pre-sighted field, often a mile wide, where a battery of 88s was dug in, camouflaged and waiting. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, but it was also the complete opposite of Blitzkrieg. The hunter had become the trapper. The war of movement was grinding to a halt. Their second solution was even more desperate. It was for the infantry, who were being slaughtered. German engineers created the Steel Grenade 41. This was a stick bomb. It was a massive 20-pound shape-charge warhead mounted on a small stick that was actually fired from the barrel of the useless Pak-36. It was, essentially, a high-tech spear. It was wildly inaccurate. The gunners had to wait for the KV-1 to get within 300 or even 100 yards. But if this flying hubcap did hit, it could penetrate the KV-1's thickest armor. It was a terrified infantryman's last-ditch weapon. But the real story, the reason the Wehrmacht was able to advance to the gates of Moscow, was not because of German improvisation. It was because of Soviet incompetence. The Red Army, in 1941, had 24,000 tanks. Over 1,000 of them were the Invincible KV-1s and T-34s. The Germans had invaded with only 3,600 tanks, none of which could match the new Soviet designs. By all logic, the Red Army should have annihilated the German Panzer divisions. They didn't. And the reason is one of the greatest what-ifs of the entire war. So what happened? Why did the Red Army, with its numerical and technical superiority, not simply annihilate the German Panzer divisions in the first weeks of the war? The answer is one of the greatest strategic tragedies in modern history, and it has three parts: leadership, logistics, and communication. The first, and most devastating, was the Great Purge. In 1937, Joseph Stalin, in a fit of paranoia, had his best, most visionary military commander, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, arrested, tortured, and executed. Tukhachevsky was the Soviet Guderian. He was the genius who had developed the deep battle doctrine, a complex combined arms theory that was, in essence, a more advanced version of the German Blitzkrieg. After Tukhachevsky was shot, his deep battle doctrine was declared anti-revolutionary. Stalin's purge then ripped through the entire Red Army officer corps. Over 30,000 of its most experienced, most brilliant, and most independent thinking commanders were executed or sent to the Gulag. They were replaced by young, terrified, and often incompetent political cronies, whose only qualification was their total, unquestioning loyalty to Stalin. The Blitzkrieg-style mechanized corps that Tukhachevsky had built were disbanded. The thousands of T-34 and KV-1 tanks were taken from these powerful armored fists and were parceled out in small packets to infantry divisions to be used as slow, lumbering support weapons. The Soviets had built a Ferrari, and they were using it like a tractor. The second reason was communication, or, more accurately, the total lack of it. The German Panzer was a symphony of teamwork. It had a 5-man crew, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator. The commander, in his cupola, was the brain. He did nothing but find targets and talk on the radio, coordinating his tank with every other tank in the Kampfgruppe. The KV-1, with its invincible armor, had a cramped 2-man turret. The commander was also the gunner. He was blind, buttoned up, peering through a narrow periscope, while also trying to aim load, and fire the gun, while also trying to figure out where his other tanks were. And he couldn't talk to them, because his tank had no radio. The standard method for a Soviet tank platoon to communicate was with signal flags. This meant a platoon of Invincible KV-1s was not a pack of wolves. It was 5 individual blind and deaf giants, blundering forward, unable to warn each other of a threat or coordinate an attack. The Germans, with their radios, could simply drive around them, isolate them one by one, and call in the 88s. The final reason was the most basic of all: logistics. The KV-1 and T-34 were new. They were rushed from the factory to the front line, with almost no spare parts, no trained mechanics, and no recovery vehicles. If a 45-ton KV-1 broke down, which its terrible transmission did constantly, it couldn't be towed. It had to be abandoned. The tank crews themselves were tragically green. Many had only 1 or 2 hours of actual driving experience before the Germans invaded. They didn't know how to perform basic maintenance. They would grind the gears until the transmission failed, or simply run the tanks out of fuel, and then walk away. This is the hidden truth of Barbarossa. The vast majority of the invincible Soviet tanks were not destroyed by German guns. They were captured, intact, on the side of a road, after having broken down or run out of gas. For every KV-1 that was famously knocked out by an 88, historians estimate as many as 5 were simply abandoned by their crews. The German tank shock was real, but the Wehrmacht was not defeated by it. They were able to advance to the very gates of Moscow by fighting a shadow army of technically superior but tactically idiotic, blind and broken down machines. But the Germans knew this was a one-time gift. They had seen the future, and it terrified them. This victory, bought with Soviet incompetence, gave them just enough time to create the real monsters of World War II. The tank shock of 1941 was about to be answered by the Tiger Panic of 1943. The lessons learned from the tank shock of 1941 were bought in blood, and they were raced back to the engineering bureaus of the Third Reich. Heinz Guderian, the Panzer general, was a pragmatist. He had a T-34 captured and shipped directly to the Waffenamt, the German Army Ordnance Office, for immediate intensive study. The German engineers, men from industrial giants like Henschel, Porsche, and Krupp, were stunned. Some were even humiliated. The Soviets, who they had dismissed as subhuman primitives, had built a tank with 3 revolutionary features they had not. Sloped armor. Every German tank was a box. The Panzer III and the IV had flat, vertical plates. The T-34's armor was angled at 60 degrees. This meant a German 37mm shell, striking this angled plate, didn't have to penetrate 50mm of steel. It had to penetrate over 100mm of effective thickness. More often, the shell would just deflect or shatter. Wide tracks, German Panzers, designed for the roads of France, had narrow 38cm tracks. The T-34 had wide 50cm Christie-style tracks. This meant when the Russian general mud season arrived, the German Panzers would bog down and sink, while the T-34s would float on top and continue to fight. A long-barreled gun. The T-34's 76.2mm F-34 gun was a high-velocity, dual-purpose weapon that outranged and outpunched every tank gun in the German arsenal. The Waffenamt was given 2 urgent, competing tasks. Task 1, the stopgap, save us now. Task 2, the permanent solution, win the war. The stopgap solution was a work of desperate genius. The Germans needed to kill T-34s now, in 1942. They couldn't wait for a new tank. They needed a new gun. They looked at their existing fleet. The Panzer III's turret was too small, but the Panzer IV, or their infantry support tank, had a wider turret ring. It could be upgunned. Krupp engineers took their new, powerful 75mm Pak-40, the new anti-tank gun designed to replace the Pak-36, and adapted it for a tank. The result was the Panzer IV, Ausführung F2. This single change was one of the most important tactical shifts of the war. The old Panzer IV, Ausf F1, with its short, stubby 75mm gun, was a door knocker. The new Panzer IV, Ausf F2, which was the exact same tank, but with a new, long-barreled, high-velocity gun, was a T-34 killer. For the first time, German Panzer crews could engage a T-34 on equal terms. This stopgap tank would become the real workhorse of the German army for the rest of the war. But this was just a patch. The permanent solution was far more terrifying. The Waffenamt initiated two projects, born directly from the shock of the KV-1 and T-34. Project 1. The Tiger. The encounter at Raseiniai had proven two things. 1. Heavy armor works. 2. The 88mm flak gun is the king of the battlefield. The order was simple. Design a 57-ton breakthrough tank, just like the KV-1, but better. Give it 100mm of frontal armor, making it completely immune to the T-34's gun. And most importantly, mount the 88mm gun in its turret. The result was the Tiger Y. Project 2. The Panther Guderian's engineers were so impressed by the T-34 that they literally proposed copying it. This VK30.02D project was rejected by Hitler, who refused to field a Bolshevik design. So they did the next best thing. They built a German-engineered T-34. It would have the T-34's sloped armor, but thicker and better made. It would have the T-34's wide tracks, but with a more complex overlapping suspension. And it would have a better long-barreled gun, a new 75mm high-velocity cannon that had higher penetration than the Tiger's 88. The result was the Panther. In July 1943, at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in the human history, the tank shock was reversed. The new stopgap Panzer HR-4s and the brand new Tigers and Panthers were waiting. The Soviet tank crews, still driving their faithful T-34s and KV-1s, advanced. They had been invincible for 2 years. They opened fire on the new boxy Tiger tank, and their 76.2mm shells bounced. The German crews, sitting inside 100 limits of steel, listened to the harmless clangs, just as the KV-1 crews had done at Raseiniai. Then, the Tiger's 88mm gun fired. It punched straight through the T-34's sloped armor from 2,000 meters away, long before the Soviet tank was even in range. The Invincible tank of 1941 was, in 1943, suddenly a death trap. The KV-1, once a monster, was now just a slow, undergunned, obsolete liability. The arms race, sparked by the shock of one invincible tank at a crossroads in Lithuania, had come full circle. The student had just become the master. The lesson was brutal, and it was immediate. The Tiger Panic of 1943 was, for the Red Army, a terrifying mirror of the tank shock the Germans had experienced in 1941. Stalin, who had ignored his general's warnings 2 years prior, was now receiving the exact same frantic reports from the front. Soviet tank crews, once brimming with the arrogance of their invincible T-34s, were now reporting that their 76.2mm shells were bouncing like tennis balls off the front of the new, boxy German Tiger tanks. The T-34-76, the war-winning machine of 1941 and 1942, was suddenly a flaming coffin. And the KV-1, it was now worse than useless. It was a 45-ton liability. It was just as slow as the Tiger, but its armor was now too thin, and its gun was pathetic. It couldn't fight, and it couldn't run. Production of the KV-1 was unceremoniously halted. The Invincible tank was officially a failure. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, was in a panic. Just as the Germans had done, they initiated their own desperate two-pronged race for a solution. Task 1. The stopgap. Save us now. The T-34 was a brilliant chassis. It was fast, mobile, and most importantly, it could be mass-produced by the tens of thousands. The problem was its small two-man turret, which couldn't hold a bigger gun. Soviet engineers, in a crash program, designed a new, much larger three-man turret for the T-34. This one change solved everything. It finally gave the T-34 a dedicated tank commander who could think, a gunner who could aim, and a loader who could load. And into this new turret, they mounted their magic high-velocity gun, the 85mm anti-aircraft gun. The result was the T-34-85. This new tank was, perhaps, the single most important weapon of the entire war. It was not as good as a German Panther. Its armor was still thinner. Its gun was still a little weaker. But it didn't have to be. The T-34-85 was good enough. It could kill a Tiger or a Panther with a flank shot. And for every one Panther the Germans painstakingly built, the Soviets, in their Ural factories, were building 100 T-34-85s. The stopgap solution, just like the German Panzer IV F2, became the war-winning workhorse. But Stalin was not satisfied. He wanted revenge. He wanted a monster of his own. Task 2. The permanent solution, the Tiger Killer. The idea of the KV Invincible heavy tank was not dead. It had just been executed badly. The KV's design team, led by Joseph Kotin, went back to the drawing board. They took the heavy-duty KV chassis, and they applied the lessons of the T-34 and the Panther. They sloped the armor. The new tank would have 120mm of frontal armor, but angled, making it, in effect, even tougher than the Tiger I. And then they gave it a gun. They didn't just want to penetrate the Tiger, they wanted to annihilate it. They took the massive 122mm M1931 field gun, a core-level heavy artillery piece, and mounted it in a new, streamlined, cast steel turret. The result was the IS-2, the Iosif Stalin tank. It was the true successor to the Kliment Voroshilov. This tank was a brute. Its 122mm shell was so large that it was split into two parts, the warhead and the powder charge. It was slow to reload, but it didn't need to fire fast. When the IS-2 met the Tiger I on the battlefields of 1944, the fight was grotesquely one-sided. The IS-2's 122mm high-explosive shell, weighing 55 pounds, didn't even need to penetrate the Tiger. It would strike the Tiger's 100mm frontal plate with such catastrophic force that it would shatter the steel, blow the turret clean off its ring, and kill the entire crew inside from the sheer apocalyptic concussion. The tank shock of 1941, the lone, Invincible KV-1 that had shocked the Wehrmacht with its armor, was just a prototype. Its true, terrifying descendant was the IS-2, the tank that would hunt the Tigers and would lead the final bloody assault all the way to the streets of Berlin.